Hey guys, Anthony here, editor-in-chief of Monkeys Fighting Robots, and I am joined today by a former Monkeys Fighting Robots staffer and current comic book writer. His new series, When the Blood Has Dried, hits stores April 10th from Mad Cave. You can pre-order it right now. It's Gary Moloney. Gary, thanks for coming.
Anthony, it's been ages.
It really has. I don't think we text and stuff, but I don't actually think we've had been on a call or talked proper since like the old Monkeys Fighting Robot podcast days.
Yeah, it was like early in the Monkeys Fighting Robots podcast days.
Yeah,
Like
probably.
that could have been 2018 by the time the last time we had a
Possible.
proper chat, face to face. Even though, like you said, we're texting the whole time.
Yeah, possibly. Now, I could have just made your whole introduction longer to this, by the way, because you're a comic book writer, but in addition to that, you're a practicing attorney. We were talking a little bit about that on air. You just had a long day in court. You're a member of Limit Break Comics Collective over there. You're a co-founder. You co-founded it with Gareth Luby and Paul Carroll,
Hmm.
and you're a father of a 2-year-old. So I really feel like we have to start this whole conversation off. I need to ask you, how much caffeine are you taking in on a daily basis? And do you sleep? Like, how is that going?
Uh, how much? Oh, that's hard to quantify. Like we got like last year, myself and my partner got a bean to cup machine, and it was a game changer. Because like we had like a nice espresso machine before that, but the
Mhm.
bean to cup were like we can just put it in, press the button, and suddenly the coffee emerges after 10 minutes. And when you're trying to wrangle a toddler, that is just like that is magic. It's just always there. Like I'd like to think that if I had it or if they permitted it, I could just carry the IV bag full of coffee around with me the whole time. But fortunately, that's not always the case. But I try to sleep. I do
Yeah.
try to sleep when I can. But sometimes life gets in the way, and deadlines don't care about your sleeping habits, even if your body and your soul do.
Yeah, I feel like any one of those things that you're doing, writer, lawyer, father, any one of those things requires like an IV drip of caffeine for sure. But yeah, I'm glad that you're doing okay. I'm glad that you're managing it all right. I did so we touched on it. So we used you were used to write for Monkeys Fighting Robots. You and me, we
I did.
joined, yeah, we're old guard. We joined in 2015 after the site launched.
Yeah, it
Like,
was very early on because like I think it was Matt had just like started it up in like like it might have been 6 months or even less than that,
yeah,
and
and you
we were having
started
the
before
call.
I did.
Oh yeah, yeah. I kind of forget how early on it was because I'd seen the he was advertising it on Twitter at the time. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that's cool because like one of the thing I'd started writing for a couple of other websites, and I was trying to get as much opportunities as I could to kind of because I just finished up in college. I wanted to kind of flex my writing muscles in terms of writing opinion pieces and writing reviews and stuff for comics. In the premise that by doing that, I could learn what makes them tick, take them apart, see how they work, do a full anatomy lesson on it, and you know learn and some of the craft, by doing. And that was a good excuse for doing it. And then that meant that I wasn't, if I was studying comics, I was studying it with a point in mind. And so like having the gig with Monkeys Fighting and Robots and doing that was a useful part of it. But yeah, no, that was very early on in the process, like 2015. Jeez, it's hard to think it's nearly 10 years ago
Yeah, and
at
we're
this
yeah,
point.
year nine. We're heading into year nine on that. Yeah, it's
Yeah, because
crazy.
I was only thinking about it the other day, going, oh yeah, it must have been 2015 because one of the first big, writing projects I remember doing was doing a kind of 12 days of Star Wars series leading up to the release of The Force Awakens. So each
Yes.
day in leading up to the release was a new either Star Wars comic or Star Wars expanded universe project that I was kind of looking at in a bit of detail.
I remember
We
that.
did
I
that.
remember that.
I think we did that for a couple of years, or I did it for a couple of years anyway, as they were releasing new
Yeah.
Star Wars films at the time when they were coming out in December.
Yeah, I remember that for I think the first big article that and we don't even do articles like this anymore, but the first one I did that really hit, it was like a whole Force Awakens theories about who Snoke would end up being, which ended up going nowhere in the long run anyway. But you kind of touched on what I was wanting to ask about that because like how you're not the first comic reviewer who is now writing his own comics. Like, we're seeing that more and more, and I think that it's going to continue happening because just with the internet, more people are able to review comics now and kind of learn about it. How did you just kind of touched on it, but reviewing comics and looking at them through that analytical lens, like it obviously paid off. It did teach you some lessons in terms of putting you on the path to writing your own stories.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was something that going into it, I knew I kind of wanted to do. I always, at that time when I first started writing for Monkeys Fighting Robots, I hadn't written any comics in ages, but I had been mainly focusing on prose and short stories and that kind of thing. But I knew I wanted to get back into it, and I knew I wanted to try to really make an effort to do it, but I didn't really know how. In that, yes, I had, Bendis's book, and I had seen what scripts looked like. I had done the graphic novel project with Cork City Library when it first launched, when they first did it back in 2008. So I'd seen what a comic strip looked like and how you would put one together. But in terms of, getting yourself out there, getting your work out there, I didn't really know how that worked. And I hadn't really studied, although I'd read comics all my life, I hadn't really studied the craft of comics in the same way that others may have. So the idea of, working for a comic site, getting to read more comics, getting to review them, and in having to review them, having to really think about, well, what works here and what doesn't work. That was part and parcel of it. That was what a kind of it was a useful exercise, because particularly remember one of the early projects that I did as well was it was just when DC Rebirth happened. So I was covering essentially every issue of DC Rebirth as it came out. So from the kind of the pilot issues they had, and then the first issue proper launches. So I was seeing, Jesus, what was it, 40, 50 different number ones, and how each one was introducing the concepts, how they introduced different ideas, what sort of panel layouts were they using, what kind of different techniques were they using. So that was very much a useful thing. And when it came to writing for the site, as much as I did, the weekly review haul as you do, I think I covered the Power Ranger comics for a long time for Monkeys Fighting Robots, and I had other different kind of different fields. Like I think I tended to be the indie comics guy. I did Boom, I did Vault when Vaults first started to really become the Vault we know them to be today. So particularly when the White Noise guys and Michael Morecci and them started working with Vault. But I always tried to focus on books that I liked as well. That yes, I would read books, and there'd be some books I liked, some books I didn't. But when it came to writing about them and what worked and what didn't work, I found it much more helpful and much easier and more value to talk about the ones I did like. So I think I tended to, having started doing the review scale out of 1 to 5 or whatever it was, I kind of shifted to a why you should be reading this book or this author or this writer or this artist, and really kind of focusing on why I thought it was an interesting book beyond the immediate issue that I had read that week.
Yeah, I remember a lot of that work. Well, I totally get what you're saying, because I think that I kind of learned a lot of the same lessons that you're describing, particularly in terms of like the actual structure and panel layouts, lettering. Learned how to talk about lettering and exactly what lettering does for a comic through working for the site and writing reviews and studying them and stuff like that. And now look, now you have your own comics coming out. And that's what we're here to talk about. I'm not going to bury the lead any longer. You have a new book coming out from Mad Cave, When the Blood Has Dried. You're writing it. You have Daniel Romero on art, Becca Carey on letters. It's a fantasy story. It's about Maeve. I know how to pronounce it now because you taught me how to pronounce that. Did I get it right?
One valuable thing I've done for the US comics community is introducing people to how to say the word Maeve.
I know how to say Maeve now, yes. It's about Maeve. She used to be part of this famed adventurers guild, but that was years ago. Like now we're seeing her. She's running an inn in this small, peaceful little town. Nobody knows about her past. And then, as it does in these types of stories, the past comes back. Is that fair? I don't want to give too much away. I don't know if you want to add anything, but I think that's a pretty sufficient starting point for it.
No, definitely. I think you've captured it quite well there. It was kind of the kind of elevator pitch was, well, what if you mixed Red Sonja with Unforgiven? Like this idea of a fantasy story that had the tonal sensibilities of a Western and things like that. So yeah, about the basically kind of play Maeve as the retired adventurer, taking the place of the old gunslinger in things like Shane, or like even Logan was a big touch point as well. You know,
Yeah.
the film version of Old Man Logan, and how, Wolverine is treated in that. That was kind of another thing that kind of influenced it. But yeah, the idea being that you focus on the part of high fantasy that happens after the adventure is ended. Like, I always considered it to be like the epilogue to a high fantasy novel series that you perhaps
Yeah.
never read, and that you're kind of coming in at the end and seeing someone who is grappling with the weight of all they have done in their life. Because the kind of the nexus of the idea, or the genesis of the idea, came from when I moved to Dublin. I started playing D&D, and I never had played D&D or any kind of role-playing game before that. I'd obviously played role-playing video games like Dragon Age, but the BioWare stuff, Knights of the Old Republic. Like, I was mad into that. But the actual pen and paper, tabletop role-playing stuff, I hadn't done that before. And when I moved to Dublin, a friend of mine introduced me to that, and I really, really enjoyed it. And it kind of it reawakened a love for high fantasy that it had not completely left me, but I read a lot of high fantasy growing up. Things because, like, you and I are a similar age. Like, we came up with the Lord of the Rings films, and so that
Yeah.
made high fantasy big again.
Yeah.
So that meant suddenly everyone was reading Tolkien again. The likes of Joe Abercrombie were getting pushed into the mainstream. Older series as well were coming back or being reintroduced. So I read a lot of that stuff. But over time, I didn't graduate from, but I just found myself becoming less interested in that, or less interested in the kind of traditional forms of fantasy, and started looking more at urban fantasy. So I'd look more at things like Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, or things like that. And really playing D&D, I started like, actually, no, I really like this setting. I like the idea of the high fantasy, the more kind of traditional version of it. But also in playing Dungeons and Dragons, I got this sense of, well, most of high fantasy or epic fantasy tends to focus on these world-ending plots. You are the chosen one, you are the hero who is destined to save the land. Or at least that's what a lot of them at first appear like. But in D&D, particularly if you're looking at a lot of versions of D&D, or different adventure styles of D&D, have you very much as a grunt, have you as someone who isn't overly special. You're just part of any number of random adventurers who just happen to be going around the place, and you're not the one who's destined to change anything. And in fact, a lot of what you're doing it because there's a reward at the end, rather than you feel, necessarily a moral obligation to do so, or anyone has called upon you to do so. So there's a mercenary element to being an adventurer in D&D, or being a sellsword. And that's obviously that's not, something revelatory really. But when I kind of really grasped that was what you were doing in D&D to a large extent, it really kind of made me think, well, okay, if you were doing that, if you were this kind of mercenary style adventurer, so often in D&D that becomes glossed over, because no matter what happens or what you do, you tend to come out as the good guy regardless. You may have stolen everyone from every single person in the village, but you got rid of the dragon at the end, and therefore they're going to hail you as the conquering hero. And your name will be retold in legends for years to come. But but a lot of it was like, well, what if you took that at face value? And what if you really played into the fact that these guys were mercenaries, that these guys were effectively a sanitized version of a criminal gang? And I said, well, how would you look at it from that perspective? If that had been your life, if you had been playing hero the entirety of your life, and when the realization of that, and the realization of everything you had done in that role kind of crept up on, and that's where kind of the impetus for Maeve leaving the guild and trying to tear herself away from that old life came from. And that's where obviously the comparator to the old gunslinger and a lot of those spaghetti westerns comes from too, because they're people who have, realized, the toll that a violent life takes on you, and are trying to learn how to carry that weight, and finding that sometimes forgiveness isn't on the table, and sometimes there's no way to make amends other than to just try to live better. And that's where we find Maeve at the start of the series.
Gotcha. I like the carrying the weight aspect of it because I've also heard you reference Cowboy Bebop in terms of an influence and a comparison and the whole carry that weight element of it too. I definitely see that in there. You had I went back and actually you had originally this has been gestating for a while, and you had I think originally mentioned told me about this or at least and which means that you've been working on it prior way back in 2020 already. Like we're going like back
Yeah.
a few years here. Like so, can you talk to me about like the process of getting from here to there to here over the 4 years? Like working on it, how the story kind of built and generated, getting with Mad Cave, working with the publisher. I know you've previously done like some self-publishing and Kickstarter work with Limit Break, but now you're working like through a publisher. Like I said, maybe, and I think yeah, it was 4 years ago that I first saw that first page that you had sent me.
Yeah, I think that because what happened was that the idea came to me, I think, or the kind of central idea, that idea of the retired adventurer and giving it the tonality of a Western, the cowboy bebop of it all, as you say, came probably late 2019. I had this image in my head of, this retired adventurer in the bar, kind of always looking over her shoulder in a way. And I knew it's something I wanted to do. I wanted to do something with. I knew that could be, a story. And Daniel Romero was someone who I'd worked with in the early days of self-publishing. So Daniel was one of the first people who I did comics with. Like Daniel is in Mixtape, the very first book I ever put together. He was one of the people I collaborated with on that. And from that, I knew that one, that we got on really well together, that we had similar storytelling sensibilities, but also that we wanted to do something longer. Like, yes, we were happy to do kind of shorter projects, but we wanted to work on something together. So the kind of standing invitation from Daniel and the standing position for me was that if I have a story and if I think that it's something that we can really push and try to pitch, we'll work together as long as it works out time. So in 2019, I kind of said to Daniel, I have this idea, or I think I presented Daniel like 2 or 3 ideas. Which one would you like to work on or start working on? And Daniel immediately went, this fancy Western one, that sounds really cool. Let's try to work on that. And so, okay, we'll do that in 2020. Then the pandemic happened. And suddenly we're all at home. Twitter was alight with all these different opportunities and all these different charity initiatives, particularly from comic writers and comic creators. And one of the things that started cropping up was that people would be offering script reviews for, if they donated to charity. And one of the people who did that was Mark Sable, who has worked with every Carpenter's Son and is a really, really talented writer. And so I took Mark up on the offer, and he said, okay, write me an issue 1, and I'll give you notes on it, and we can have a chat about it over Zoom. So that gave me the kick up the arse to actually write the damn thing. So, because at that point, I think I had the first 5 pages done. I had what I said in that I had them written out. There wasn't art for them yet. So that meant okay, all right, I have a purpose to write the next 15. So did that, gave the script to Mark, and Mark said, this is good. There's a potential here, pitching into a publisher. So one, that was a great boost of confidence, but it also meant, okay, now I have the goal as well. This is the story that I'm going to pitch. So from that, I gathered the money together. Daniel and I said we would get the first 5 pages done up, and a lot of different things had to come together. Daniel had to be finished his particular working schedule. He had to have gap to be able to do it. So from there, the first script was written, the first 5 pages were drawn, and then in early 2021 we started getting them lettered by Becca Carey. And so we had the pitch packet, or at least the pitch pages, ready in 2021. And as you alluded to earlier on, in 2021 I became a father. So that meant the the time that I had to pitch it around and shop it around. So I think that was that was less available as it had been
Right.
before.
Sure.
And I wanted to make, yeah, go on.
No, I just said, yeah, absolutely. I can understand. I mean, not personally,
Yeah.
but I just in general, yeah.
So I didn't have as much time. And I knew that like I wanted to get this right. Because while we had the pitch pages, the pitch document as well is something that's so, so important. Like you hear everyone talk about like, yes, you know, you can have the best pitch pages, but you also need to be able to sell them the rest of the story and show them what the book will look like and what kind of markets does it cater to, what themes are you addressing, what does the outline for the rest of the series look like. So I spent, but it also has to be done really in a very short, you know, page count.
Yeah.
Like 2 pages really is what's considered the max. So I spent a long time working on that, perfecting it. And another consideration was I need to find a home that, you know, will allow us to preferably, you know, keep the creator owned, ensure that everyone is looked after. And it was at that time in November 2022 when I'd kind of polished it up, had it ready to go. That was when Mad Cave announced that they were doing open submissions. And Mad Cave up until that point hadn't been doing open submissions. They've been doing the talent search every year, which was this really cool initiative where they were getting new writers and new artists in, and they still do it. But then they announced in 2022 that they were expanding that outwards and that they were having these open submissions periods. So I think it opened on the 1st of November, and immediately I tossed in When the Blood Has Dried. So I had the pitch pages, I had the pitch document, and we also had mock-up covers and a lot of concept art because we'd been working away at this in the background. And every now and then we'd come back and we'd add different things to it. So we had a lot of this background material built up. And so I sent that off. I went to Thought Bubble in the UK, and I came back the week after with an email from Mike Martz from Mad Cave asking if the book was still available and if I was interested in publishing it with them. And that led to a really fruitful and really rewarding collaboration with Mad Cave throughout all of 2023, where we kind of signed the contract formally in January, and we spent the entire last year working on this book, giving Daniel the time he needs to make the book the best possible version of itself, working with Mad Cave's like wonderful editorial team, James B. Emmett, Mike Martz, and the whole crew over there, who really helped push the book to be what they saw it could be and what they knew it could be. They've been amazing champions and advocates for them, but also advocates for Daniel and myself and working with us from the editorial side of things, pushing us where we needed pushing to ensure that we weren't just, you know, making it good enough, that we were making it the best possible version of SFSB. So it's been a really rewarding experience. And it's telling that if you ask anyone who's worked with Mad Cave, like to a person, like they have nothing but good things to say about them.
Well, that's awesome. I'm glad that you have such a good experience, like right out the box on. I mean, that fostering that supportive atmosphere. I mean, I think that's probably why you have such an intriguing, just captivating story on your hand. And that pitch pack you're saying is the first few pages. Great pitch packet, by the way. You know, you talked about Daniel Romero. He's incredible on this book. It's just his character work is great. The world building, the whole town, everything is just really cool. But those first few pages, which people like, they can go to Mad Cave's website and see the first few pages that I'm talking about here are just. I'm looking at them on my monitor here. Just the rain pouring down, blood-soaked, bodies all over the place. It throws you right into it, and it immediately grabs your attention. It's not even like indicative of what is going to come following it. It immediately just grabs you and holds on to you. And it's just, I mean, it is a great pitch. It's a great, like, this world is interesting. It's very cool. Very cinematic. It feels like a scene out of a movie kind of thing almost. So I can imagine, I can understand entirely why those first few pages would have sold Mad Cave on this. And again, just testament to Daniel on his work on the people really should go to Mad Cave's website and check out those first few pages after listening to this. Um,
No, Daniel's a revelation. Like you said, like those first 5 pages, and they're the first 5 pages of the book. Like those are from 2021. So
mhm.
as the book goes on, you can see everything Daniel has learned since then, and he's coloring himself, and he just brings there this wonderful texture to the world, which sometimes you don't get when other people are coloring an art.
Yeah, no, there's
But because Daniel does the line work and the color, he's able to really give it a wonderful atmosphere.
yeah, there's a texture to it. Exactly like you just said. That's a great way of putting it because there's like the world feels lived in. It's like I said, it's post adventure. She's lived her life. She's lived her adventures. Like and there's like a layer of grime to it almost. It's kind of withered. It's I'm trying not to be like too cliche about it with like there's grime on the pages and stuff like that, but it feels lived in. The whole world feels lived in. Daniel really creates a mood, an atmosphere for this whole world. Um, Now, you talked a little bit about working with the publisher and getting the story built. Now, we mentioned Limit Break, the collective that you're a part of. You guys have put out some anthologies before. I actually have them sitting right here just to kind of uh, show you that I got my copies that I love. Now, you edited, Fractured Realms down below. You guys published them. How did editing, kickstarting those things uh, influence you as a writer? Because when you're doing these projects, you have direct contact not only with the creators whose works are in these anthologies, but then you have direct contact with the backers, the people who will be reading this stuff at the end of the day. So how do you take everything you learned from those Kickstarters and put them into, okay, now I'm writing this, I'm putting it out through Mad Cave, a publisher, like, I'm a little bit more removed than I was with the Kickstarters, but what lessons do you take into that?
I mean, it's important to emphasize as well that kind of Mad Cave is very good at keeping you part of all the process. Even though we have our central editor, everything I was commenting and getting to contribute to every kind of part of that process. But when it came to what I learned from doing the stuff with Limit Break and editing and co-editing the anthologies with Paul, I think a lot of it is that because those anthologies are short stories, and I put a lot of stock and a lot of value in the short story as a format in comics. I think perhaps it's something that we don't value as much as we should in terms of what it can teach you as a creator, because it forces you to really understand the layout of a page and the value of the single page as a storytelling unit, and also how a page needs to work on its own part of the spread. So you need to know, of course, where your page turns are, and what's going to be a spread reveal. And so you try to ensure, of course, that anything surprising happens on the left-hand side because you're not actually read the right-hand page even subconsciously. So you can't really surprise someone with something on the right-hand side of the page. So having to edit a lot of four pagers, that was something that became very, very, very constant. I became cognizant of, okay, well, what can you fit into a single page? What can you reasonably fit into a single page? But also, how do you take into account of where it's going to be in terms of the book, in terms of what kind of a spread is it going to be on, and what might you need to change in order to make sure that every page turn works and has that effect and has that impact that really the page turn has in comics that it doesn't have, say, in a novel. You don't get that same surprise or that same chance to transition from, say, one scene to another in prose as you do in comics. So I learned a lot about that. And then it was interesting because this is the longest thing I've written now. Because before that I did 4 pagers and I'd done a one shot, which was 30 pages. So this is each issue of When the Blood is Dried is 20 pages and there's 5 issues. So that's the longest thing that I've worked on. So I had to really kind of figure out, okay, you're used to working it really primarily in 4-page chunks. So how are you going to expand that out? How do you make sure that it's going to keep going and you're not just like a gas and filling up the space that you're given, but making sure that each spread has a purpose and a reason for being there, and also should have, primarily two things going on. To be obviously one layer of things that you're doing, but also another thing happening in the background. So trying to build that in, and I think a lot of the times when I was editing the anthologies, it was seeing how other people did it and like seeing how other people would use the space they were given, and then trying to implement those lessons so that when I had more space than 4 pages, I really understood what to focus on and tried to get the most out of the page count that I had, so that it wasn't just I was adding 2 pages here for the crack, or I was spending more time here than was necessary. I was trying to make sure that each scene, each kind of spread had a reason to be there and told you something about the characters and told you something about the world. And that's why, you see people, those who've say come up in British comics or who broke in via 2000 AD and the Future Shock system there. I think that's why they say, doing Future Shocks, doing those short stories is so valuable, because it means that when you get, because you've learned to value the economy of a 4 pager and the economy that you're required to sort of adhere to when putting together a short story. When you are given more space, then you value it more, and you can then apply those lessons to longer form works.
I think that's you're
I don't know if that
you're
makes sense, but
no, it makes total sense. And I had a follow up that you pretty much just answered already. I also just want to say real quick that we had a bit of a connection. I don't know if it was on if you saw it on your end, but there was a little bit of a connection issue on my end where it broke up a little bit. So if there was a delay in my response or to anybody watching this, I just want to apologize for that. It broke up, but you seem to be coming in clearer now. Now I was going to ask you about that because something I love about When the Blood is Dried is the pacing. This story like moves along at a clip, like not in like a rushed way or anything like that. It's just it it moves along. Get your hooks in the reader with those first few blood-soaked pages, and then you just keep the story moving. You keep it moving and building on it, and you hold the attention. And it's something I really love about your storytelling in this. And I was going to ask you specifically if writing shorter stories in the anthologies and your background in short stories influence that because of you have that economy of pages. And it seems like the answer is yes. You got ahead of me on that one. But that does explain why this story seems to, every few pages really does grab you and move it along and build on it and stuff like that. I think that's really interesting that, it's almost kind of like the flip side of you see long form writers, like maybe like novelists who take a turn at writing comics. And it's almost kind of the flip side of that, where they're a longer form writer and having to cram everything into like 20 something pages. It's maybe almost kind of the reverse of it. Whereas coming from writing 4 pages and learning the economy of a page, I don't know. That's interesting to me. Now,
yeah, I think that's something that I think that's definitely there in terms of like the pages and thinking in 4 page kind of chunks is probably kind of had that influence on working in this, and whether that changes over time, I don't know when because once you start writing to the 20 page format, does that change how you approach things? But I think even if you look at the likes of Al Ewing and his work over at Marvel, like a lot of that is very kind of quickly paced, and there's so many things going on. And again, I think that comes from the fact that he spent years working in 2000 AD. Like he did X amount of Judge Dredd's, where he had to establish the story, establish the setting, get out of Dodge in 4-6 pages, whatever it was. So I think there's a value to that. While of course there's also the opposite value of like, okay, well if you have 20 pages, then you can work towards that format. But I think having those limitations does help you and does kind of push you to work within them and be more creative within
yeah, I also really like because even though the pacing is it moves it along and it's great, you do have these built-in quiet moments and these these little small moments that are really great at developing character and again world building and whatnot. And I really particularly love you have specific panels, even just like little panels that are just charged moments. Like it's a glance, it's someone brushing a hand off, it's like, a wave, or just like an insert of a face inside of another panel. There's so much said in those little charged panels without saying anything, obviously. How intentional are those moments? Is that like a Gary thing that's in the script, these little moments of like a hand brushing or something? Or is that something that Daniel adds to add emotion and just subtext?
They're there in the script, but they only work because Daniel sells the hell out of them. Like,
Yeah.
it's something that I built into the script, like building in the quieter moments, because, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that, particularly in the first issue, right, the story, as you summed up at the start, or one of the kind of key conflicts in the story, is how does Maeve's violent past, coming back to haunt her, how does that affect her life in the town? And to what extent does it put at risk when she's managed to carve out this bit of peace for herself, and suddenly she risks having all the dirty laundry aired in public, and having those people who only know as the barkeep now look at her in a different way, and how that might rob her of that solace that she's managed to achieve. So, in order for that to have weight and to have impact and for readers to care, you have to understand, one, why Maeve would value this place. Carrigan Vun, the kind of rural village that we set this in, which is very much based on what kind of rural life is like in Ireland. Because you see, one of the things that they describe Maeve as in Carrigan Vun is that she and Fergus, the dwarf who she runs the bar with,
Love
they
Fergus,
refer
by
to
the
them as
way.
blow-ins.
Love Fergus.
Fergus is great crack to write.
I was gonna ask you,
Sarcastic.
yeah, I was gonna ask you who your favorite character, because it had to be Fergus. It had to be Fergus, the favorite one to write. He's so much fun.
He's very fun to write. He's very fun to write. But like, they're considered blow-ins because, as much as they might have been part of the town for years and years and years, they weren't born there, and they weren't reared there. And there are certain parts of, rural Ireland where people are very welcoming. The communities are very welcoming, and you will see, you know, people who have moved from abroad, who've come to live in Ireland, or even who are just from outside of that town, who they might have been, city folk before that, and they moved to the seaside village. They're welcomed and they're made to feel part of the community, but but there's always an asterisk attached to it. They'll never be part of the community, and there's always this kind of loving prodding and poking fun at them as the blow-in. So they could have been there for, 30, 40 years, but they'll always be blow-ins. They'll always be slightly outside the community setting. But you kind of have to understand why Maeve would like the town and love the town and feel it's something worth protecting in order for the conflict to have weight. But also then, in terms of like the kind of quieter moments and those kind of glances, those things, those were very, very important for me because as much, and while I appreciate, you the comment about, that you feel like that it goes at a clip and that it feels like a lot's going on in it. I think it's important as well to kind of dwell on certain things. No, I think decompression in comics has gotten it was the mood for so long. It was the meta of comics for ages. It was that you did a decompressed story, and oftentimes you'd wonder after as well, could that not have been 2 issues of a six, but it was dragged out over a 6-issue arc. But I think purposeful decompression, allowing, the kind of heavy moments, like very core story beats to sit with the characters, is really, really important too. And it's one of the few things that comics does that no other medium can. Like, no other medium has a silent reaction panel. Like, there is no equivalent to that, where, you have a silent reaction panel, and because readers are kind of collaborators as well in the process, they can stay on that silent panel for as long as they want. So like they can feel the kind of gut punch in the same way that the characters can. Particularly if someone says something that they shouldn't have said, or a revelation. Like, I think building those moments in is so important too, in order to like give those parts of the story weight, and also like that's another part of the kind of the Cowboy Bebop inspiration of it all. Like that, like some of the most memorable moments to that we think of when we think back on that series is, you know, Spike or the crew just smoking together in silence and just reflecting on everything that has happened. So I wanted to try to build in that sense because I think that's part of the genre trappings as well of a Western is just having those moments of quiet contemplation. And so I wanted to have that in the book as well. And again, the only reason they work as well as they do is because Daniel just sells the hell out of them. Like there's good ones in issue one, there's a fantastic one coming in issue two.
Can't wait, man. There is, I mean, I'm looking at one right now. Like, just because, yeah, I do think that the pacing is great and it keeps your attention. Like those quiet, slow moments, like it doesn't slow the story down at all. Like it builds the character. I'm looking at a 9 panel grid right now from issue one. That's just Maeve wiping down the bar, filling a glass, taking a drink, opening the bar. Basically, it's a page. It's not a word spoken on it. Uh, doesn't slow the story down at all. Again, you're building her, you're building who she is, you're building this tavern and stuff like that. I'm a Tom King fan. I'm a big fan of a 9 panel grid, so I loved this. It's just a great moment. Um, and God, is there a lot of drinking? God, is there a lot of drinking in this comic? Too. Just
Yeah,
watching her.
I,
Yeah,
I- I'm not helping the stereotype, setting a lot of this story in a bar, uh,
yeah,
and like particularly having having the main character being a particular fan of whiskey. But yeah, like that 9 page. Like, look, I'm a Tom King fan as well,
yeah.
and I love like playing with the form and formalism in comics. So like in the first issue, I intentionally kind of put in a nine panel grid to kind of one to see if I could do it, but also like like there was also a reason for it to kind of put emphasis well to talk about like the panel in the middle is meant to be the most important panel for a 9 panel grid. So seeing how I can use that to tell the story uh was really, I don't think I do a 9 panel grid again in the series other than that one moment. But I think again there's a reason for why I asked Daniel to do that because I don't like restricting Daniel. I like to let Daniel go and do his because he knows it better than anyone. Like a lot of my panel descriptions, yes, they'll give the essential information that's needed. So if there's a gun on them could be fired at the end of the issue, that's there. But
Yeah.
really, a lot of what I tell Daniel is about the intent behind the scene and how characters are feeling and what particular thoughts are running through their head, so that informs Daniel's character acting that he draws on the page then. And so that I say those quieter moments make sense because the thoughts may not be expressed on the page, but you can understand what's going through their head because Daniel has interpreted that on the page and how he's drawn those characters. So a lot of time the because people talk a lot about that your first audience as a writer is your artist, and you need to make sure that they're engaged with the story, or else you're not going to get anywhere. So that was one of the things that I have tried to do for Daniel while working on this book is to give him those kind of insights, which then really allows him to sell that in the artwork.
I want to circle back real quick to influences on this while we're talking about character moments and Fergus in particular, who we touched on, because I see the Logan, I see the Unforgiven, Red Sonja, Bebop. You mentioned a little bit about being a gamer, an RPG guy. Um, just gonna throw it out there. You a Witcher 3 guy? You a Witcher player?
Do you know what? I only started playing Witcher 3 like during the pandemic.
Okay.
Before like by the time I had written the first issue, I actually hadn't played much of Witcher 3. I think I'd done the introductory section. There's that kind of like
Yeah.
cornered off tutorial area where you can play like 8 hours of the game, which
Yeah.
for a lot of games would just be the entire thing. Like, so I played a lot of that at the time. I still haven't finished Witcher 3. Like every now and then I have it on Switch, I go back to it and I play
Yeah.
another few quests and go, this is class. And
Yeah.
then
I haven't
I
beat
go
it
off and do
either.
something else.
I've got
Yeah.
close to 200 hours probably in the game, and I haven't beat the main story yet. Like I'm an obsessive gamer where I have to like before I move on to the next section of like whatever I have to do every single quest. But I only asked that because the scene where Fergus is standing in front of the town's message board and like oh there's like war notices and this that the other thing it felt Witcher 3 to me because it's that thing where you blow into a town and you go to the Witcher to the message board to get your Witcher quests and stuff like that. So it just felt like that to me. But it
Yeah, but that's like, kind of a part of the reason, like, again, like I mentioned earlier, the influences being like the initial kind of inciting mission being, rediscovering high fantasy through D&D. I wanted to kind of include that. So like, obviously the guild structure is there in the book. Like the part of the tour of Carrigan Vun that you get is that, you're brought through the town, you're brought to the town where all the stuff, which, gives us the opportunity to tell you a little about the world too.
Mhm.
This is a very kind of localized and parochial story in that the majority of it takes place in this one small rural town, and you don't see the kind of the wider conflicts that are taking place or the wider, you know, political dynamics. They're hinted at, and you can see them if you're looking for them. But things like the town centre and having the quest board and things like that helps give it that feel, so that they're familiar to people, but then they can give you that kind of wider insight too. But like for sure, like that's things like you see that in Dragon Age, you see that in kind of any D&D thing. But like Witcher 3 wasn't an initials, but like afterwards, like I watched the Witcher TV series. I've got Jesus most of the novels over there on the bookshelf. Uh,
It's
and
a
I've read a good chunk of them, and I really really like yeah, and I really really like them. Like I really like the Witcher. I like the Witcher the Witcher feel, the type of world the Witcher is, which is it's high fancy, but as much as you have these mages and stuff, and you have these kind of people who can use magic, you know, there's a cost to that.
mhm.
It's not just you can't just go around slinging magic for the crack, because magic in the Witcher universe has a price. And in that way, it's kind of similar to the Warhammer Fantasy universe. And that is both of those. I like that idea in fantasy. A lot of the fantasy novelists that I really really like, say Joe Abercrombie, have that idea of yes, it's high fantasy, but it's low magic, or that to the extent magic exists, you have to be careful. It is this chaotic force, and it will eat you up if you let it.
Yeah,
So I,
I
I,
like
I
that.
like
Yeah.
that. So I kind of
No, that's just
that
an
kind of
interesting.
that kind of
Yeah.
informed what kind of world this is.
Yeah, and I totally see that because like you see stuff in this. Like I said, Fergus is a dwarf. Like you have elven characters. There's reference to monsters and stuff, but you don't necessarily see it in this world yet. But I think there's room for it if you ever want to grow this universe out. There's definitely room for it. But I thought that was interesting, even like the reference to monsters that we never actually see, at least in this at this point of the story. Again, just
Yeah.
helping
Well,
helping.
like
No, go ahead.
yeah, but I think a bit of that as well is that yes, you can see all those things, but the idea is that this town is very kind of cut off. It's very rural. A lot of those things which might be commonplace for a lot of people, they don't see them because it's an isolated place. So I think, but we definitely wanted to show you that they were there. And look, if the book does massively well, would I like to come back and do more in this universe? I think there's stuff there. This was always pitched as, and the story itself is self-contained. It's 5 issues. It's got its beginning, and middle, and end, and we tell a self-contained, satisfying story within those five issues. There is a satisfying conclusion to Maeve's arc here and the characters' arcs here. There is a wider world that we could play with, but it was very very important to me that I think a lot of times in fantasy you see people who are like the focus is on the world building, and that can be a fun side element to it, but I wanted to focus on really kind of grounded character approach to the storytelling here. So yes, there's a wider hints at the political dynamics that are going on for those who want to dig into that. But it was important to me that really this story could be in any setting. Really. It's it's written as if it's a crime story or if it's a Western story. It just happens to be taking place against the background of a fantasy world. But this could just as easily be a modern day story that doesn't have any fantasy or science fiction elements to it, or it could be in the far future. The core of the story would remain the same, even if the setting changed.
I want to run with that real quick because so even going to your previous works that you've edited the anthologies again, like, you're dealing with mythology, you're dealing with fantasy, you're doing with it again now. And, in the past you've mixed it with noir, you're mixing it with horror. Now it seems like you're mixing it with like, the Western thing. What is so alluring about A, writing these fantasy mythology stories, but B, playing with it in all of these different ways? Like it's never like it's not that it's not enough to just do like the fantasy story, but like we're gonna do fantasy by way of horror, Western, noir kind of thing. Like what is, you know, so alluring about that it's become like a I don't want to say a habit, but just something that, you've done to excel a few times now.
That's a good one. That's a good one. That's one that I haven't really thought of, I suppose. But
It happened by accident, kind of.
well, it probably did. But if it happened by accident, it's because there's an underlying reason for it. I think I like a lot of the books and the comics and stuff that I read would kind of have a mix of things. So like
Hmm.
having say transition early on in or like in my teenage years and reading a lot of high fantasy to leaving a lot of urban fantasy. Like urban fantasy is essentially, it's fantasy trappings, but different types of stories. So Jim Butcher's Dresden Files are noir crime stories that she to put Philip Morrow as a wizard. Like that
Hmm.
it's like it's that kind of a thing. I think what mixing genres does, or like having those kind of things that touch on different aspects of a genre or a mythology, is that it really kind of allows you to interrogate what those genres are about in a way that maybe just doing kind of a pure analysis or a pure approach to it. Because I think, like, so say for Down Below, when we talked about that back in 2021, 2022 when we were funding that. And one of the things I was said at the time is that the logic behind mixing Greek mythology with noir crime stories was that both at their heart had this kind of bitter sweetness to them. The Greek tragedy, someone often who is going up against the odds, going up against the gods, and is kind of doomed to fail but tries anyway, and or is often made to pay the for their own hubris. And you would see a lot of the same things in noir crime fiction where someone's going up against systematic or systemic issues, be it organized crime, corrupt police, you know, indifferent government, and just trying to survive those encounters. So combine the two really allowed you to kind of interrogate both. And I think in a lot of ways, fantasy, as much as we describe things as fantasy and we describe fantasy as a genre, it's perhaps unhelpful as a genre just to say something is fantasy, because really all that means is that there's some fantastical element to it. And even if you go as far as to say high fantasy, all that really tells you is that, it probably looks a bit like Lord of the Rings, or it looks a bit like Game of Thrones. It doesn't tell you what the story is really. And say something like A Song of Ice and Fire. Yeah, that's a fantasy, but really it's political intrigue. It's a political thriller that happens to have dragons in it. And a lot of the power dynamic and the clashes in Song of Ice and Fire would be just as interesting, regardless of where they took place. So I think that particularly for fantasy, maybe I think this is why you see a lot of talk these days, particularly with the types of comics that are being released, is sword and sorcery. Because sword and sorcery as a subgenre within fantasy means a particular kind of thing. It means the Conan the Barbarian of it all. These
Hmm.
kind of procedural, more action focused stories. So I think that kind of mixing those two, that one mixing kind of mixing approaches allows you to really dig into the heart of what they're about and what you really find interesting about them. But I think as well that you kind of that's a lot of the genres that we talk about are really settings or aesthetics more so than they are, types of stories. Like saying something in science fiction doesn't really get you far. Saying something is a superhero story doesn't really get you far. If you tell me that, say, something like Sleeper is a superhero story, but it's an espionage story, then you kind of get more closer to what the feel of a book is.
I have my omnibus of Sleeper over there as well, right next to those question omnibuses that you made me
The
buy.
omnibus. I did
I
not
did.
make you buy anything. You know, if anything, you can blame Denny O'Neill and Denny Cohn
Well, when I'm
for
explaining
for
it,
making you buy the question omnibus.
when I'm explaining it to my fiance, I'm blaming you. I can't really blame blame them. Um, no, I totally
I
appreciate
blessed you with
that.
knowledge of those series.
You did, and I appreciate it. I appreciate it personally. The person I share my house with might not as much, but I appreciate it. Uh, so I probably brought my own Witcher influence into it because that's my back. You talked a lot about D&D, being a huge influence on it in the message board. I shamefully, admittedly, I want to play D&D more than I ever have. I've played some abbreviated sessions. I've never like done like a full proper campaign. I need to. And talking about that and talking about the world and the world building of the story, I just want to touch on it. I think I might have an opportunity to play a pretty good D&D thing coming up, right? Do you want to touch on it?
Yeah, so one of the thing because yeah, we can touch on it. So one of the because D&D is part of the inspiration for the book, and there's no getting around that, the to kind of like to honor that in a way, but also because it allows you to build out the world. We are going to be doing some D&D compatible tie-in material. So we're going to be doing an adventure module to kind of to tie into the series. So uh, I can't say much more than that, but alongside the book, we're going to be releasing something that kind of allows readers to really live in that world and to explore some of the same issues that Maeve had to go through.
And I love that. I think that's so interesting, and a great way to build out the story as well and get just put readers in the shoes and get them invested in it. And again, someone like me who desperately, I do want to get more into the world of tabletop RPGs and D&D and stuff. I think that's a great entry point. I know Gillen did something similar for Die a few years back that I also didn't haven't had a chance to actually play yet. But I just think that's really cool when comics kind of expand their reach into other mediums, tabletop gaming and stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to whatever that turns out to be, and we could talk
Yeah,
more about that
and
at a
and
later
Philip
date.
K. Job. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. Hopefully, we can have a chat about that when it's announced. It shouldn't be too long before we can talk about it properly. But I think it's something that people are going to enjoy, and that it's going to be something that whether you are a comic fan or whether you are just a tabletop playing fan, I think this is you know, something that you will enjoy. And I think there's a lot of crossover, obviously, in the audiences between tabletop role playing and comics. You just have to look at the likes of Jim Zub, who write both. Like I said, Philip K. Johnson did time material like that for The Last God when it was being released by Vertigo. I think it was Vertigo at the time before it ultimately became a Black Label book.
I
But
think it
also, I think that
started as a Black Label book.
something like that can did it start as Black Label? Okay,
I think it might
yeah,
have.
but but in any event, like I think that something like that can help bring in new people to comics as well. And like I think it's funny if you think about the kind of the skills are kind of some of the things that you do when you're writing comics. A lot of it is trying to communicate, the essence of something to an artist or to an audience. And I think a lot of that can be seen in, a well written mini adventure. So like
Yeah.
like hopefully it's something that people enjoy. I think it's something that adds to the experience and adds to the book. You don't lose anything from not reading it or not playing it, but it'll give you a bit more appreciation for the time of the world, more so than anything else.
And it's definitely a great way to get people reading the book and reading comics because I mean, so many comics. I mean, I was in my local comic shop earlier today, and so many comic shops they do the supplemental, the tabletop gaming, the card gaming. They have a whole section tables where people come in and play. Who, it's almost kind of like factions. Like they come in, I come into the shop for the comics, they come into the shop for the gaming, and it's almost like a crossover kind of thing. They could one day they have a gaming thing with one of these tie-in products, and it kind of brings both sides together in the shop and kind of just brings everybody together in a really fun, cool way. And at least that's how it should be, and how I hope it does play out um, for you and all of these
And there's such
comics that are trying it.
yeah, and there's such a strong history of it as well between things like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles role-playing game, which was a big thing back when it launched, kind of alongside the comics and alongside the initial cartoons. Like that was a big thing, as was the original Marvel superheroes role-playing system. Like a lot of those systems that were then transformed into sort of, serial numbers filed off versions. But like and they became very popular systems of play in and of themselves. But like there's always been that connection between the communities. We have free comic book day, but from that there also came free RPG day for a while. I'm not too sure if it still goes on, but like that was there too. So I think there is like linkages and commonalities between the two communities that we should really look at kind of fostering as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
Jim Zub is clearly the master of it, but
I, I want to ask, stepping aside from this story in general, kind of on a grander scheme, get a little personal with you on this one. We mentioned before that you're a father of a 2-year-old, became a father over the pandemic and stuff like that. Uh, has that influenced your writing in any way? Just as someone who, again, a new father who had started writing prior to being a father, and now, how has that influenced you as a writer going forward? And in the way that you tell this, I mean, this is a very bloody story. This is not a kid-friendly story by any means, and it doesn't need to be. But do you see any changes in yourself as a writer, having a young son?
I think so. I don't I there's no getting around the fact that I'm not the person I was before, having my son. Like, I am my priorities change, what I value, a lot of that changes in that. And so I think in this book, in When the Blood Has Dried, there are kind of two father figures or mentor-like figures in the story, one of whom has, a what could be considered a positive relationship with Maeve, and one that is a kind of toxic relationship with Maeve. So I think that like I don't that was there before my son was born, before he was even on the like a twinkle in anyone's eye. But I think it really kind of made me like take a look at that and be like, okay, well, how do I approach that, and how do I consider fatherhood or that kind of positive parental figure in fiction and what it serves. I think it's something that perhaps will inform different aspects of my writing going forward, like in terms of what I put priority on. But I think one of the so Maeve has these kind of two figures who are male figures who are influential in her life. She has Traylock, who took her in after the guild, you know, ambush her and you know leave her for dead. And so she kind of learns from him. And then there's Darius, who was her mentor when she was in the guild, and who we see in those opening pages, is the one who deals what he think is the final blow. And so part of it is trying to is maybe kind of weighing both of those influences in a large proportion. But I think, but that was already there before I became a father. I think it more so it's that, it makes you reconsider what's important. And perhaps that on a subconscious level has changed the way I dealt with some of those characters, or perhaps how I wrote those characters more so than anything else.
Yeah. It's just interesting that you were writing this over the course of not only becoming a father, but living through the pandemic and stuff like that. Just how that stuff influences you subconsciously on a weird level over the course of writing a series. I'm kind of interested. It might have even been subconscious. I'll be interested to see over the course of the 5 issues if there's any like kind of weird subtext happening at any point. If all of a sudden in issue 4 a plague hits and everybody has to stay indoors, I'll
Well,
know that something hit. Oh, did I lose you?
I think one of the things that is clear from the first issue, at the very least. No, no, I'm still here.
Okay, you froze up on me on my side. I
Can you
apologize.
hear me?
Yeah, no, I can hear you. You froze up for a second.
Oh no, but okay. But but I think that even from the first issue, you can kind of see that a lot of the book is about the value of community and about trying to hold on to, a found home in that sense, which is, if we want to get all armchair psychologists on this, something we were all kind of going through in the pandemic. We were kind of reassessing how important, our communities, our friendships, our found families were to all of us. And as much as this is, like even like When the Blood Has Dried would fall into that kind of grim dark, characterization of fantasy, like it does have this, harsh and community aspect to it that is, so important to the book because it's what Maeve is desperate to keep a hold of. And whether she's able to do that or not, and what are the consequences of holding on so tightly to it, is really what the book is about in a larger sense.
I think that's a great I think that's a great place to leave it, honestly, my friend. I think you've really made a compelling case for like what makes this story so interesting. And it is, as someone who has read it, it is a very interesting world. It's a very interesting story. I hope that everybody has a chance to pick it up. It's April 10th is the release date, right? Issue 1 comes out on April 10th. FOC final orders are due March 10th or 11th,
April,
depending on the distributor. So make sure you call your comic shop and have them order it. Um, before we leave things, I always like to ask you because I always get recommendations and I always get stuff for my shelf. What have you been reading lately, Gary? What should I be reading? I got a couple
oh,
of spots
geez, what
left.
have I been
I
reading?
got a couple of spots left on my shelf there.
One of the things I've been reading lately, because my time for reading has gone down drastically,
Sure.
uh, in recent times, as you might expect. But like, there's a couple of things I'm reading. I've continued reading all of the Massiverse titles. So Kyle Higgins, Ryan Parrott, Mac Room, Melissa Flores, they're tokusatsu adult Power Ranger style books. Like I've really enjoyed them, so I've kept up with them throughout. But in terms of books that you may not have read, there's like a couple of manga that I'm reading at the moment that are really really interesting. So I'm reading Master Keaton, which is an early Naoki Urasawa book, which is really his kind of take on the procedural cozy. Oh, you have it.
I have the first volume. I haven't read it yet, but now it's moving to the top of my list.
No, it's brilliant. Like so, it's like Urasawa is one of my favorite like mangaka. Like going back to the point you made earlier on about like say like those kind of quiet moments where things linger. Like that is so much of Urasawa's work. Is you have those scenes or those pages where characters just let that silence fill the room, and like I think that's so powerful. But that's his kind of take on the cozy mystery, the cozy procedural mystery. Like it's his Poirot, it's his Miss Marple. So that's really, really good. The other one I've been reading lately I'd started it a while back, but I really kind of caught up. Is the one called Golden Kamuy, which is a book from Satoru Noda. It's this kind of post-war pulp adventure book. It's one of the Viz signature series that kind of focuses on this veteran of uh, this Japanese war veteran who is a a treasure in Hadaiko, which is kind of this like indigenous region, this region of Japan that has a lot of indigenous culture and indigenous people there. So it's kind of a race by multiple factions, political and otherwise, in Hokkaido to try to find this treasure. And the main character teams up with one of the indigenous peoples there, and it's about a lot of the book is about the kind of the bridging of the cultural gap and understanding the two cultures learning to come to understand each other. Uh, but it's a really great kind of you know pulp, yes, pulp adventure, but also pulp adventure with a lot of heart and like consideration behind it.
I'll check it out. I'll check it out, and I'm gonna definitely move Master Keaton up on my
Now,
list too.
oh, you're going to love it. You're going to love it if you've
I
loved
love
it. Like
Urasawa. Yeah,
Pluto is right here. Like Pluto is right here on the shelf, and like that's one of my favorite books of all time. But yeah, Master Keaton has been like really much a very good read. It's also one that I think you can pick up and put down a lot because like the most of them are self-contained or there might be two or three parters, but there's no like long necessarily overarching narrative that's going to be 3 volumes worth.
well,
You
that's
kind of like have your satisfying chunk of story and move on to something else.
that's like the perfect kind of story for a writer, lawyer, father, person to have to be able to jump in and out of. Um, but Gary, I got nothing else for you, my friend. Thank you so much for talking to me. Again, When the Blood is Dried #1. It's out April 10th from Mad Cave Studios. Call your comic shops. You got another 2 weeks to order it. It's well worth it. Take my personal recommendation.